everyone, today we're doing things a little bit different. We're covering an organization that doesn't just break the rules, they exist functionally outside of them. Now, most Space Marine chapters live and die by the Codex Astartes, and even the divergent chapters are generally restricted by the rulebook written by the big man in blue himself, Reboot Guilliman. But today we're covering the Deathwatch, and they don't much care for your standard organizational structure, as they operate on a level of sacred oaths and secret bases that would make a conspiracy theorist weep with joy. Now, starting with the basics, instead of being born from the gene seed of a specific legion, these warriors are handpicked and pulled out of chapters from across a galaxy to fulfill what functions as a debt of honor to the Imperium as a whole. Think of it kind of like a Spec Ops program that somewhat resembles Rainbow Six Siege. But instead of learning new tactics in a classroom and being sent back, you're being sent to a watch fortress orbiting a desolate rock in the literal edge of the galaxy, ready to be deployed. And these aren't just normal bases. They're massive, completely and utterly silent citadels, black ops sites that function as the Imperium's early warning system, staring into the dark void of nothingness and waiting for the Xenos to blink. It's lonely, it's dangerous, and it's arguably one of the most important jobs in the Imperium. Now, the aesthetics here are where things kind of get fascinating for many. When a Marine joins the Deathwatch, they undergo a ritual that is as much about identity as it is about duty. They paint their armor midnight black in order to signify their absolute service to the Emperor. However, this isn't just the standard don't mess with me spirits moment, because they never paint the entirety of the suit, as this would be an insult to its machine spirit. And if they ghost the sentient consciousness living in their gear that they refuse to admit is sentient, even though at times it has continued to move even when the Marine is long dead, they take certain precautions. But it also functions as a way of forcing unity upon the group, as the only marker that shows that they haven't forgotten where they come from is that they leave a singular shoulder pad untouched, proudly displaying the chapter's original color and iconography, while the other side gets a cold, rather cool, silver icon of the Deathwatch to replace it. And this, in its totality, functions as a way to represent a warrior that's caught between two worlds. One of the most interesting parts about the Deathwatch is that there's no 2-week notice in the Deathwatch. Once you're in until your commander says, "We no longer need you," and then they just drop you back with your guys, unless you request and they admit you for prolonged service. And this isn't a standard tour of duty, which could last a singular surgical strike, a few decades, or even centuries. There are even some that, due to their chapter being supposedly wiped out, have remained in the Deathwatch for far longer than the standard. As when you're part of the Deathwatch, you essentially are a ghost to your former brothers until your mission is over. And if you're lucky enough to survive and return to your original chapter, you do so under a sacred oath of silence, which can only be commanded to be broken by your chapter master. However, you will be seen as a rung higher, and your skills learned within the Deathwatch will be percolated back into the chapter through you teaching, as you've seen things that would break the mind of a normal man, and you've purged the darkest corners of the galaxy. Now, as you've gone back to your day job, you're not supposed to mention exactly what you did. Basically, it's a what happens in the Deathwatch stays in the Deathwatch type situation. Now, where things get really interesting is when we look at the Deathwatch and how it actually functions on the ground. They aren't just there to kick down doors and start blasting. They are the Imperium's premier Xenos hunting specialist. We're talking about the shield that says the Chamber Militants of the Ordo Xenos being part of their kit. Their job description is basically a checklist of nightmares, cleansing the alien cultures, recovering forbidden artifacts claimed by said alien cultures, and studying technology that would make a standard tech priest faint and salivate to death at the same time. Sometimes they even use the enemy's own weapons against them, like a Khitan's phase sword being oddly similar to some of their equipment. It's a high risk, high reward type situation that often requires constant vigilance and only the best of the best of the best within the 41st Millennium's premier combat units to be deployed. When the Deathwatch team hits the dirt, they operate with a level of authority that's generally kind of terrifying. Usually they're led by an Inquisitor or perhaps a legendary captain or librarian in some more extreme cases, where their word is now absolute law. Functionally, they can requisition anything they want: ships, ammo, planetary resources, other space marines. They are functionally the warriors of last resort when dealing with Xenos. If the Imperial Guard is getting slaughtered and a standard Space Marine chapter is too far away to help you, you pray for the Deathwatch to come and save your behind. But they'll only come if they're dealing with aliens. If you're dealing with a demonic infestation or some rebel human groups, tough luck. When they show up, conventional warfare has functionally failed. And while every Imperial citizen is functionally relieved to see them, there is an underlying dread, because if the Deathwatch is there, that means the situation is well beyond terrible. Unlike the massive armies of the Astra Militarum, the Deathwatch keeps it rather personal. They don't do companies or battalions, they operate in kill teams. These are small elite groups of specialists, each a veteran from a different chapter who would normally be leading a cadre of other forces, and they each bring their unique culture and flavor of violence to the table. You might have a Space Wolf and a Dark Angel working together. Two groups that historically don't like each other very much, forced to share what amounts to a Space Marine-sized foxhole, or what you would call a massive house-swallowing sinkhole, and rely on one another to survive. It's basically a high-stakes, alien-hating breakfast club type situation. And they're fighting off an endless tide of Tyranids, Orcs, Necron, the Tau. Now, being chosen for the long vigil is the highest honor a Space Marine can normally achieve, but it's also a heavy burden. These are to be the absolute best of the best, handpicked for a tour of duty that is so top secret they can't even tell their own battle brothers what they've done once they get back, unless explicitly told by their chapter master. Or if it's Dante, because, well, he has authority almost nearing that of a Primarch in half of the Imperium. And more often than not, they stand as the first, and regularly only, line of defense against some of the most disgusting evil alien abominations that keep just percolating out of the darkest corners of the galaxy. They keep a silent watch, constantly observing the movements of the Orcs, the Drukhari, even some Xeno species which the galaxy at large has no idea still exist. Supposedly they've even faced up against examples of the Harad. They've even kept the spectral Khitan at bay, and it's thanks to this secret and incredibly dangerous life that when they get back to their chapter, suddenly said chapter becomes incredibly efficient at dealing with a certain type of problem. But it's just an average Tuesday for these men in black. Now we have to ask ourselves, how do you get the most stubborn, independent super soldiers in the galaxy to actually agree to work together with a bunch of spooky, often really squishy and impalable Inquisitors? Well, like most things in 40k, it starts with a nightmare. The most widely accepted origin story for the Deathwatch takes us all the way back to the War of the Beast in the 32nd Millennium. And this wasn't just your average orc raid, this was a greenskin invasion so massive it actually threatened Terra. The Imperium was caught lacking with its pants down, and Crueland, the last surviving Imperial Fist and Lord Commander at the time, which you have to realize, it's kind of weird that the Imperial Fists keep being driven basically to extinction over and over and over again. At this point, their gene seed might not even be theirs anymore, since we found out that multiple of the chapters who have previously donated to them were actually of Ultramarine descent. But he realized that standard warfare was failing, and he needed something more, something surgical. Small, elite teams of veterans who could slip through the cracks and cut the head off the snake as one does. This was the birth of the kill team concept, born out of absolute world-ending desperation. Crueland knew that for this elite force to survive long-term, they'd need an internal political backing. However, he didn't want it to become just another tool for high-ranking Terran bureaucrats to abuse. So he thought outside of the box by thinking inside of the most mentally unstable box of the Imperium, the Inquisition. And he reached out to a representative from the Inquisition named Winand, and the agreement basically went as follows. The Inquisition functionally gets the firepower of multiple Space Marine chapters, but the Space Marines stay in charge. The pact eventually led to the Deathwatch being officially folded into the newly formed Ordo Xenos as their Chamber Militant, much like the Sisters of Battle are the Chamber Militant for the Ordo Hereticus, and the Grey Knights being basically the muscle for demon hunting, except nobody's supposed to know about the 666th Space Marine chapter who keeps popping up every time a major demon incursion occurs. But the Deathwatch is a hyper-specialized scalpel for everything with too many eyes, too many ears, too many noses, and too many tentacles. That isn't a standard mutant. But since this is a Warhammer, there's always a version B to every story, hidden in some vault. As some records would go on to claim that the Deathwatch didn't start with a war, but rather with a secret meeting called the Apothecarian Conclave or Fight 4. This was basically a room full of Inquisitor lords arguing for years upon literal years about how the world was going to end. Some thought aliens should be the priority of the Inquisition. Others, the braver yet completely insane, suggested an alliance with the Eldari. They foresaw an age where humanity would be swallowed up by monsters from beyond the galaxy or enslaved by ancient sleeping gods, basically the Tyranids and the Necron. They didn't know when it would happen, but they knew it was coming, and they decided to prepare for the inevitable. This conclave eventually did something almost unheard of. They requested an audience with a massive group of chapter masters. We don't know exactly what was supposedly said, but the records do exist. However, they remain sealed under layers upon layers of red tape. And if you know anything about red tape and oaths in Warhammer is, you're never getting through all of it. But whatever the Inquisitors told them was terrifying enough to work, and the chapter masters seemingly all agreed to a solemn undertaking, promising to send some of their best warriors to serve in this new secret vigil, explicitly to eliminate Xenos, those who had proven themselves to be particularly skilled at said task. Whether it started as a desperate move against the orcs or a paranoid plan by a secret council, the result was the same: the creation of the ultimate line of defense. The Deathwatch became a long watch, a brotherhood of veterans who gave up their names, their titles, their collars, and their honors to ensure that humanity wouldn't just go quietly into that cold and dreadful night. Now, if you want to understand the sheer, terrifying scale of what the Deathwatch has to deal with, you just have to look at the world of Antitheum. It was a planet lost to a gene-stealer cult, an alien-worshipping insurgency, until Watch Captain Safor and his brothers arrived. They fought for 5 days and nights in a literal sea of fire. Against all odds, they walked out of the smoke victorious. This is a long vigil in practice, taking the war to the darkest reaches of the void and bringing a level of violence that no single Inquisitor could ever dream of. Inquisitors, they operate as equals within the Ordo Xenos. The Inquisitor finds a monster and the Deathwatch puts it down. But lately, that thin black line in protecting humanity has been stretched to its absolute breaking point. We are now in the era Indomitus, and the prophecy spoken about in the ancient conclave is finally coming true. The shield that slays is being hit from every direction. You've got the Eldari trying to burn bright one last time before being snuffed out. Their dark cousins, the Drukhari, are raiding entire planets just to stock up on slaves before the end of all. Then you've got the Necron dynasties, and they're waking up faster than the Deathwatch can smash them back down into place. Even the orcs, who are usually busy fighting each other, thanks to the Deathwatch's own acts of sabotage, are finally uniting under Gazgul Mag Uruk-Taraka. It's a literal green tsunami of violence that threatens to drown the stars, and the Deathwatch is standing right in the middle of the surf with nothing but a bolter and a prayer. Then there's the worst of it all, the Tyranids, the ones that keep the Inquisitors awake at night. High Fleet Behemoth and Kraken were bad enough, but now High Fleet Leviathan has emerged from under the galactic core, and a large segment of it is heading right for Terra, the seat of humanity's civilization. This has led the Deathwatch into calling in every ancient favor and every sacred oath they ever have, begging for more Marines, but the galaxy at this point is so broken that many chapters actually are asked for their brothers to be given back to them. Every Space Marine is needed to fight and claw back whatever they can from the demons of chaos, which the Great Rift has allowed to ooze into reality, like a mold, like a slime mold, leaving the Deathwatch primarily to face the alien apocalypse with fewer resources than ever before. It's essentially a desperate game of whack-a-mole, where the moles are about the size of skyscrapers and have acid for blood. Now let's move on to from exactly where the Deathwatch operate. Rather than a singular planet or fortress monasteries, the Deathwatch operates from watch fortresses, which are these massive, secret space stations that are completely erased from Imperial records, basically future time black site. These are sovereign domains ruled by a watch commander who has the authority to put entire sectors to the torch if he thinks it'll stop a Xenos outbreak. Places like Castillos Nullfact watch the Necrons, while Fort Pikeman stares at the nightmare known as the Ghoul Stars. Since the Great Rift toward the galaxy in half, many of these watch fortresses are now stranded in Imperium Nihilus, the dark side of the galaxy, where the Emperor's light doesn't quite reach. They're isolated, surrounded, and cut off, often having to look for aid from Fleet Nihilus, Dante's own massive near-legion-sized workaround for the Codex Astartes' size limits. So they're basically isolated, surrounded, and cut off. Yet, they refuse to quit. As a famous Inquisitor once said, these fortresses are the watchfires keeping the darkness from swallowing humanity whole. So we've talked about the massive fortresses, but the real spooky factor comes from the watch stations. These are much smaller, lonely outposts scattered across the most desolate corners of the galaxy, hidden within moons, in dead worlds, within literal freezing voids. Some look like gothic bastions with eagle-headed gargoyles staring into nothingness. Others are just jagged needles of metal, bristling with sensors and seer webs that skim the warp for whispers of alien movement. Most of the time, these stations are completely empty of human life, functioning as ghost ships run by the most advanced automated systems the machine cults can build, waiting decades for a single space marine to walk through the door. If the station is ever discovered and breached, it does not surrender. Rather, it'll self-destruct, vaporizing every scrap of technology so the Xenos cannot learn even one of its secrets. Information is also the Deathwatch's greatest weapon, as every watch station has a massive data reservoir sucking in communications and witch site readings from the surrounding sector en masse. This info then gets dumped directly into the Deathwatch's specialized high-speed ships called Dark Hunters, and they're basically stealth bombers in the 41st Millennium, designed to slip straight through the stars unseen, hopping from station to station, harvesting data like a galactic Grim Reaper. When a kill team is on the field, they can drop into these hidden outposts, rest, reload their bolters, use its medical facilities, and gain information about what's going on in the greater area around them. It's like a network of movable safe houses built specifically for the ultimate monster hunters, ensuring that no matter how far from home they are, those on the long watch never truly rest. And when it's finally time to go from watching to killing, the Deathwatch doesn't just wing it. They use a hyper-specific set of strategies developed over thousands of years from trial and error to ensure the best results, completely disregarding the Codex Astartes and most chapters' normal tactics. If they're walking into a situation blind, they use Aquila tactics, the ultimate prepared for anything generalist approach. But if they're facing a specific nightmare, they swap gears. For example, if they're fighting an ocean of orcs or Tyranids, they switch to Furor tactic, which focuses on creating a wall of corpses so high the enemy behind them can't even climb over it to get to you. If there's a massive bio-titan or a godlike alien leader, they break out Malus or Purgatus tactics to hammer the biggest thing on the battlefield until it stops moving. One of my favorite bits of the lore is Ventor tactics. These were actually pioneered by Jehan Khan to deal with the lightning-fast witch cults of the Drukhari. It's a high-speed game of cat and mouse where space marines on bikes lead the enemy into long-running battles, drawing them into a death trap set up by the rest of their crew. While the Xenos think they're the ones hunting, heavier units are quietly moving into position to snap a trap of massive arranged firepower. It's a perfect example how the Deathwatch takes the best ideas from every chapter, the speed from the White Scars, the stoicism and defensive acumen of the Imperial Fists, and the rending fury of the Blood Angels, and remixes them into the toolkit for the most efficient killing machines the galaxy has ever seen. Now, it's not just tactics that set them apart. They also have a series of secrets and specialized gear. The history of the Deathwatch is written in the blood of things that shouldn't exist, and it stretches back to that first, desperate last stand during the War of the Beast. But once properly established, they became the Imperium's premier problem solvers for anything non-human or demonic. Take, for instance, when they went after Fabius Bile. This abomination of a space marine was busy trying to stitch the DNA of aliens into his twisted experiments to create the ultimate monster. While he may be a Chaos Space Marine and deal with the demonic, it technically falls under the purview of the Deathwatch since he is using Xenos DNA. And the Deathwatch didn't just send a strongly worded letter, they actively raided his labs and fought through what the records call fleshy hells, then burned the entire complex to the ground. One of the most fascinating entries in the entirety of their history involves a little crossover rendezvous with the Grey Knights. In the Endish subsector, two orc warlords were killing each other so efficiently that the sheer amount of spilled blood was actually thinning the veil of reality. The Grey Knights quickly realized that if any more blood was shed by conventional blades or bullets, a portal to Khorne's realm would tear open. The Deathwatch quickly stepped in with a plan that sounds like a fever dream. They fought the orcs using only blunt weapons, thunderhammers, power mauls, and other tools that wouldn't break the skin. And they practiced on how to bludgeon a warlord in a way that would avoid the spilling of blood altogether. But this came at a staggering cost, as half of the kill teams were lost due to using such inefficient methods. The surviving orcs, terrified and confused about what exactly was going on, left the sector and flew straight into the Eye of Terror. Problem solved, I guess. The Deathwatch are also masters of psychological warfare. There's a story about Fortress Omega, where the Eldari Corsairs launched a massive raid to steal a Doomsday Sphere. They fought through waves of elite Venator kill teams, losing hundreds of their own, only to finally break into the inner vault and find absolutely nothing. The Doomsday Sphere was a lie, a piece of misinformation planted by the fortress's black shields in order to lure the Corsairs into a meat grinder, knowing the math that as a literally dying race, the Eldari just don't have the numbers to replace such losses. And even though a Space Marine is a veteran of hundreds of years of battle and quite rare, they still greatly outnumber the Eldari and have the ability to produce more on a scale unimaginable to the Space Elves. They functionally turned the Eldar's greed against them, leading them into a trap that should have been obvious, as it had been set centuries before. But what remained of the Corsairs left behind a sea of alien corpses. As we move on to the final years of the 41st millennium, the era known as the Shield Shivers begins to become more popularized surrounding talk about the Deathwatch, as a shift from surgical precision to absolute back-to-the-wall desperation. This is where things get somewhat morally gray. Take Inquisitor Quipman, for example. He saw the Tyranids of High Fleet Leviathan devouring everything in their path and realized the Imperium couldn't win a fair fight. So, with a little help from the Deathwatch, he pulled off one of the most controversial moves in history. He captured a bunch of gene stealers and essentially unleashed them into the heart of the Orc Empire of Octarius. The idea was to force the two most dangerous alien threats to the Imperium to fight each other, stalling the inevitable long enough for humanity to catch its breath. It worked. Unfortunately for all those involved, it turned the entire sector into a massive literal meat grinder of Xenos on Xenos violence. The orcs would adapt to the Nids, then the Nids would adapt to that adaptation, quickly becoming stronger and more efficient at specifically killing each other. And eventually, the tides would turn, and the orcs would functionally lose. While they're still fighting in the Octarius sector, the majority of what was left of this high fleet has moved on. And the Deathwatch isn't just fighting wars in the conventional sense, they're also performing interdimensional heists on a planetary scale. In the Gravissimius subsector, when they couldn't stop the hit-and-run attacks of Eldaris from Craftworld Baeltan, the Deathwatch decided to go for the throat. And so they descended upon a maiden world, basically a planet that the aliens had set aside to make a paradise at the very height of summer, and they set the entire planet on fire. It was a brutal eye for an eye move, and the strategy lured the Eldari into a trap where they were systematically eliminated. Then there's Kill Team Aldrich, who actually smuggled themselves into the dark city of Komarog, the literal capital of the Drukhari, and they did this by sneaking inside a wrecked alien starship just to rescue a captured Space Marine captain from the gladiatorial pits. It's a kind of Mission Impossible situation that should be impossible. Yet the Deathwatch were able to pull it off. But for every victory, there must come a sobering reminder of how thin the line between veracity and annihilation truly is. And to best explain this, we have the Gosar Quintus anomaly, where Chaplain Cassius discovered a gene stealer cult so deeply rooted that it had already spread across the entire segmentum. Then there's the story of the blessed wormlings on Masuchi Par, where a 7-man kill team was simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of cultists. Even their fortresses aren't safe anymore, as Fort Volsia was completely and utterly dismantled by a Necron overlord because an Inquisitor was foolish enough to bring a stolen Necron artifact inside that functioned more or less like a teleport beacon. These aren't just win some lose some scenarios. These are catastrophic blows to the Imperium's best lines of defense. As the end of the 41st millennium brings us closer to the end of all things, we see the Battle of Port Demarus being a rather important incident within the Deathwatch's history, where Watch Captain Artemis famously stopped the Eldari Farseer Eldrad Ulthwain from fully awakening the God of Dead. It was a victory for the Deathwatch, sure, but it was a massive what-if that changed the fate of the galaxy forever, because if said God was awake, there was a chance for Slaanesh to have been slain. However, Watch Captain Artemis made the calculation of a known unknown being safer than an unknown unknown, functionally operating under the ideology of better the devil you know. Now, with the Great Rift having torn the galaxy in twine, the Deathwatch is facing its darkest hour, as Space Marine chapters are actually demanding their veterans back in order to defend their struggling homeworlds. Some Watchmasters are going so far as to openly refuse the chapter master's request to let their men go, while others are watching their garrisons dwindle just as an alien apocalypse finally arrives. The long vigil has become a desperate scramble for survival in a galaxy that's breaking itself apart. Now that we're here at the modern day of the era Indomitus, and we see that things are more complicated than they were before, to say the least, because there's been some massive glitches in the Imperial calendar. We aren't even sure of what year it is, but what we know is that the shield that slays was just seconds away from shattering completely. That is until the big boy in blue popped up. Rabut Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, issued the Ultramaris Decree. As he didn't just send a few extra guys, he funneled entire chapters worth of Primaris Space Marines directly into the Deathwatch permanently, functionally creating a Space Marine chapter made of distinct Space Marine chapters that was larger than a Space Marine chapter should ever be allowed to be by the Codex Astartes. But as you can imagine, not everyone was happy about it. You had old school veterans like Watch Captain Holgar Ironfang, who looked at these shiny Primaris brothers with nothing but scorn, until a Primaris team had to bail him out of a greenskin ambush. Holgar would actually go on to step down in order to serve as a regular grunt under the Primaris captain he had insulted. And for a Space Wolf, that's some serious humble pie he's eating. There's also the rather haunting story from this new era, which takes us to the world of Daimal, which was being overrun by the Harad. If you don't know, the Harad are actually these nightmare fuel creatures that are literally able to eat time. And they turn that into a weapon that hyper-ages all those around them. Entire regiments of Imperial Guard would wither into old men in a matter of hours. This meant the Deathwatch had to send 2 entire companies and 8 dreadnoughts to lead the charge, because the dreadnoughts were already ancient machines, and the Space Marines within were already strapped with uncountable amounts of life support systems. They were the only ones able to survive the Harad's time warping aura long enough to win the day. But the victory was hollow. When the smoke cleared, the dreadnoughts were silent, rusted to husk. Inside their armored sarcophagi, there was nothing left but dust. The Harad had stolen literally every last second of life, as their own lives were stolen. In this desperate age, even the Inquisition is getting creative. You have guys like Inquisitor Balthus Bale, who started using literal alien technology to navigate the warp within Imperium Nihilus. His ship, the Castris, was a Frankenstein's monster, a patchwork of both human and Xenos technology. And luckily for humanity, it worked just well enough to get the Deathwatch into a fight with the vile Tau. But when the Tau tried to board the ship to see how he'd done it, the Deathwatch had to blow the whole thing sky high. And this was before humanity was able to get it to function in any way that was replicable at scale. This is one of the perfect examples how the Deathwatch function with a core contradiction. They study the alien to kill it, but they'll burn their own progress to ash before they let the alien even take a whiff at a single secret from them. In this desperate chaos, the Deathwatch is evolving further still. They've started a Weapons of Wisdom program, where kill teams travel to isolated worlds just to teach the local humans how to fight against the Xenos abominations that are coming for them. They're even compromising on their ancient oaths. When 20 chapters begged for their veterans back, Watchmasters sent them home, but they let them keep their black armor. These Marines were returned as strategic advisors rather than members of the chapter in full, bringing the Deathwatch's level of expertise back to their original brothers, being allowed to tell them everything they had learned, whether it's hunting bio-titans alongside Imperial Knights or surgically dismantling gene stealer cults during a warp storm. The Deathwatch is proving that while the shield may have shivered, it hasn't broken. They are the masters of the calculated strike, leaving the messy planet-wide wars to everyone else, while they cut out the heart of the threat before it ever has a chance to prosper. As time goes on, the Deathwatch find themselves in the middle of a storm of 3 fronts, deep within the Chandaleth expanse, a region that is basically a distillation on how quickly a sector can go from unstable to an absolute nightmare. This place is a pressure cooker of civil wars, fear-mongering prophets, religious uprisings, but the real threat here that was uncovered by the grizzled old Inquisitor Jazdar Dornutor was located rather late into the upheaval, and he quickly sent word to the Watch Fortress on Mortegard that the Tau Empire wasn't just poking at the borders anymore. They had moved in. The Tau had wormed their way into the poverty-stricken frontier worlds, posing as enlightened saviors while they slowly dismantled Imperial control. If they took the pivotal worlds of Cestus and St. Haltz, they'd have a direct warp route to the Segmentum fortress at Cardanish. Watchmaster Agathron didn't wait for permission. Instead, he mobilized 3 entire watch companies, suspecting the Tau weren't the only monsters hiding under the bed. So they were basically sent to 3 different worlds, Adjourna 4 being one of them. And as it seemed, the watch captain's gut feelings were right. While the Inquisitor was looking for Tau ships at the edges of the Adjourn system, the Deathwatch went looking for the rot inside, and they noticed that the trade guilds were raising massive private armies, ostensibly to fight the Tau, but something didn't quite seem right. Watch Lieutenant Alvor led a teleport strike team directly into the servo ducts beneath a major guild house, and within minutes they ended up fighting something, but they weren't fighting the Tau. They were being absolutely positively swarmed by gene stealer aberrants and other hybrids. It was a 3-day slaughter in the dark, but by the time the signal could be sent through the psychic static of the Xenos, only Brother Tyvrus was left alive to teleport back to orbit, and he carried a rather ostensibly grim report. The entire system wasn't preparing to defend the Imperium. It was already a laboratory for twisted alien experimentation. Adjourn 4 fell shortly after this, but the Deathwatch now had the target that they needed to bring in the specialized tools. Meanwhile, on the barren peaks of Kestis, the Tau were playing a different game. They'd set up research stations under the guise of scientific study, bribing local pirates to keep them secret. But the Deathwatch knows that in the Tau terms, research stations is just another word for forward operating bases. Watch Captain Seraphus launched a full-scale armored assault, sending in land raiders screaming through the mountain valleys. The Tau responded with hidden drone turrets and high-tech battlesuits that turned the valleys into kill zones. What was supposed to be a surgical strike turned into a grinding battle of attrition. It was a perfect example of the Tau's use of technology to level the playing field against raw transhuman power that comes from Space Marines, forcing the Deathwatch to adopt a hammer blow tactic in order to better siege them and eliminate them from the sector. The absolute peak of this madness actually happened on St. Hult, a shrine world where billions of people lived between acidic seas and massive reliquary palaces. The Deathwatch cruiser Void Sentinel arrived. At that point, the world was already a chaotic war zone. You had Sisters of Battle and Imperial Guard holding the line against Tau cadres, while Gene Stealer cults, calling themselves Hiveworm, were hanging loyalist corpses from the arches of Hive cities. Watchmaster Agathron played the battlefield like a grandmaster, using his kill teams to sabotage the Tau's shielding, then sending in storm speeders to rescue the trapped Sororitas, and eventually driving the Tau directly into the path of the cultists. He effectively forced two alien threats to start killing each other, while the Imperium regrouped, much in the same way that the Octarius War had been started. It was cold, calculated, and rather dirty. But in war, honor is a luxury the Deathwatch can no longer afford. And finally, we have to look at the Octarius War, or what's left of it. For years, the Imperium felt safe knowing the Orcs and Tyranids were busy killing each other in a contained box. But with the Great Rift sending everything into complete chaos, the unthinkable has happened. The shockwaves of the Rift broke the stalemate, as massive Tyranid organisms and hulking Orc Scarboys are now spilling out of Octarius into the surrounding systems, as the watch fortresses of Doombreak and the Eye of Octus, alongside with Führer's shield, are all screaming for reinforcements. It is well understood by the Deathwatch that the dam has finally burst, and that they are standing right in the path of the flood of the most brutal, battle-hardened Xenos in the galaxy. So let's wrap our heads around about how this massive galaxy-spanning operation actually stays functional. To do that, we have to look at the organization itself, because the Deathwatch is spread so thin across the stars that it doesn't have a single chapter master sitting on the throne of some world giving out orders. While they had one briefly during the War of the Beast, the mission is just too big at this point. They're spread far too thin. So instead, the Deathwatch has a collection of sovereign domains. Each Watch Fortress is its own little kingdom, ruled by a Watch Commander. These commanders are the final authority of the sector, and they will answer to no one but the Inquisition. The Deathwatch is basically a collection of sovereign domains, and they manage everything from their own libraries of forbidden scrolls and even armories full of experimental Xenos-killing tech. For the longest time, Talsa Prime was the heart of the whole thing, the primary training grounds for every Marine who wore the black of the Watch. But like all things in the 41st millennium, the Great Rift happened and ruined it, cutting off half the galaxy. Now, if you're stranded in Imperium Nihilus, you aren't going to Tazla Prime. You're actually going to look for places like Fortress Exploris or Parafrex Venator to keep the fires of the Long Vigil burning. And you're going to have to bend the knee to Lord Commander Dante, the Lord of the North and Regent of Imperium Nihilus. Now, the anatomy of the fortresses, the ones that still remain, is rather lean. Most fortresses break down into 5 watch companies, led by a watch captain. But don't think of these like 100-man companies you see in chapters like the Ultramarines. A Deathwatch company is usually about 50 battle brothers, and they prioritize quality over quantity every single time. Within those companies, you have the heart of the Deathwatch, the kill team. This is a team of bikers, jump pack specialists, melee and close combat, and even masters of stealth, all grouped together. It's a mix and match approach to warfare that makes it impossible for even the most devoted of Tau to figure out just what they're dealing with. And finally, we have to talk about the secret handshake that makes it all possible. The fact that the Deathwatch is the Chamber Militant for the Ordo Xenos. It means they are the hammer to the Inquisition's scalpel. They are so tightly integrated with the Inquisition, you'll often find Inquisitors working with the Deathwatch, to the point you've even had stories of them digging in a little bit too deep, too often into the chapters of the blood, to the point that the chapters of the 9th bloodline have assigned permanent members of the Deathwatch from their chapters in order to correct the Inquisitors' mistakes of looking far too deeply into things. You'll often find the Inquisitors fighting side by side and planning operations in strategic council with Deathwatch proper. They aren't just the soldiers from their chapters anymore. They're the ultimate enforcement arm for the people whose job it is to know everything about the alien. Basically, it's a marriage of convenience, power, and absolute secrecy that's kept humanity alive for millennia. And even as the rest of the galaxy tears itself apart, they seem to function with an unparalleled level of cooperation with each other. That's actually quite shocking in the Imperium. So at the end of the day, the Deathwatch are the thin black line standing between a crumbling Imperium and a galaxy full of things that want to turn humanity into a snack or an ever-screaming, never-dying footstool. They give up their names, their colors, their chapter's history, and their livery in order to fight a war that most chapters aren't even allowed to know is happening. It's a lonely, brutal, and often thankless vigil. But as long as there's a single watch fortress still burning the pyre in the void, the alien will find no easy path to the doors of humanity's inner sanctum. Now, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the Imperium's premier Monster Hunter squad, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps me in the algorithm. And leave a comment down below to let me know what exactly you'd like me to cover. And subscribe so you don't miss out